I am Nia, 32 years old and a director of cybersecurity. Hand my dad the keys. Nia, my husband Marcus demanded, tapping his fingers impatiently against my custom marble kitchen island. My family is moving in today. I looked at Marcus, and then at his father Thomas, who was already dragging his heavy designer suitcase across my pristine hardwood floors with a smug, entitled grin. I did not yell or cry. I simply smiled, took a slow sip of my red wine, and said exactly one sentence. The arrogant smirk vanished from Thomas's face instantly. The expensive crystal glass he had just poured himself slipped right through his fingers, shattering into 100 jagged pieces on the floor. Before I tell you how those parasites ended up digging their own graves, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against in-laws who mistook your silent grace for weakness. To understand how we reached that shattering point, you have to understand what this house means to me. We live in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. For those who know the area, it is a community where affluent Black families build their legacies. The sprawling modern estates, the perfectly manicured lawns, the quiet tree-lined streets. It projects a certain level of elite success. But my foundation was not built on trust funds or political connections. My foundation was built on bleach calluses and late-night shifts. My parents, David and Sarah, do not wear tailored suits or attend charity galas. For 25 years, they ran a commercial cleaning business. They scrubbed the floors of towering office buildings, sanitized corporate bathrooms, and emptied heavy trash cans for executives who would never even look them in the eye. They saved every single dollar they earned with a singular, fierce focus. They bought this $1.8 million modern estate outright in cash. And because my parents are as street-smart as they are hardworking, they did not just hand me the deed. They placed the entire property into an irrevocable trust. I am the sole beneficiary. It is a legal fortress designed so that no one, not a bank, not a lawsuit, and certainly not a greedy husband could ever take it away from me. When I married Marcus, I thought I was marrying a partner who shared my drive and my values. Marcus worked as a financial investment and crypto broker. To the outside world, he was the absolute definition of modern success. He stepped out every morning in crisp Tom Ford suits, smelling of expensive cologne. He drove a sleek black Tesla, and he always made sure to casually pick up the tab when we dined out with his friends. He absolutely loved the image of being a high-rolling provider who took care of his wife. But behind the closed doors of our estate, the reality was entirely different. I was the one secretly paying the massive American Express bills every single month. I was the one covering the Tesla payments when his risky crypto trades inevitably went sideways. I tolerated his financial smoke and mirrors because I loved him, and because I mistakenly believed he just needed a little more time to hit his big break. I kept my mouth shut and paid the bills to protect his fragile male ego. I never threw my success in his face. I preferred to stay quiet doing my highly technical work from my home office while he played the big shot in public. I remember one specific evening when my parents dropped by to bring us fresh groceries. My father David still had his work boots on from a long shift. Marcus actually asked my father to wait on the back porch because he had important clients in the living room and did not want to ruin the aesthetic of his business meeting. I was furious, but my dad just smiled his tired, gentle smile and told me not to cause a scene on his behalf. That was the moment my love for Marcus began to rot. That was the moment the blinders came off. That same enormous ego was completely inherited from his father. Thomas was a former city councilman whose political career had ended years ago, but who still walked around demanding to be treated like local royalty. He was obsessed with status and deeply, deeply classist. My mother-in-law, Brenda, was exactly the same. She treated every family gathering like she was holding a royal court where she was the queen mother passing absolute judgment on everyone around her. Then there was Marcus's younger brother, Andre, a 30-year-old man who had perfected the art of living off his parents. Andre was married to Chloe, a white woman who embodied the absolute worst traits of entitlement. Dinner parties at my home were a masterclass in psychological warfare and emotional restraint. Thomas would sit at the head of my dining table swirling the expensive wine I had purchased with my hard-earned money and make thinly veiled remarks about my parents. He would look around my gorgeous home and say, "It is just a real shame your folks had to scrub toilets to get here, Nia." I could never imagine doing such menial labor. He would laugh his booming, arrogant laugh, and Marcus would just sit there silently swirling his own glass, entirely complicit in the disrespect of the people who literally provided the roof over his head. Not once did my husband stand up for the people who had given us so much. Chloe was her own special brand of toxic. She would walk through my living room picking up the sentimental hand-carved wooden ornaments my parents had brought back from their rare vacations to the Caribbean. She would wrinkle her nose with a look of pure disgust and tell me that I really needed to throw out this cheap-looking junk because it made the million-dollar house look so ghetto and poor. She loved to drop these racist and classist microaggressions wrapped in sweet fake smiles. She constantly acted superior because her family had generational wealth, even though she and Andre were currently living completely rent-free in Thomas's basement because neither of them could hold down a real job. I swallowed their insults week after week, year after year. I bit my tongue so hard it bled because I was trying to be the bigger person. I wanted to be the supportive wife who kept the peace in a difficult family. I smiled through the blatant disrespect toward my hardworking parents. I ignored the fact that my husband was a financial parasite wearing a designer disguise. They all looked at my quiet demeanor, my simple clothing, and my introverted lifestyle, and completely misjudged me. They saw a woman who worked long hours staring at a computer screen and assumed I was a passive bank account they could abuse without any real consequence. They mistook my silence for submission. But they forgot one very important detail about who I am and what I do. I am a director of cybersecurity. I make my living identifying hidden threats, neutralizing malicious attacks, and destroying dangerous viruses before they can infect the entire system. My entire family-in-law was a virus that had slowly infiltrated my life. They thought they had successfully hacked into my world and bypassed all my security measures. They thought they had won. But that day in my kitchen when Marcus confidently demanded I hand over the keys to his pompous father so they could take over the home my parents bled for, they finally triggered the firewall. And the system lockdown I had prepared for them was going to be absolutely merciless. Let us rewind to the very foundation of this entire disaster. My parents, David and Sarah, are not the type of people who end up on the covers of financial magazines. They do not come from generational wealth. They do not have trust funds or Ivy League legacies trailing behind their names. For 25 grueling years, they built their entire life around a commercial cleaning business. While men like my father-in-law Thomas were busy shaking hands at country clubs and making backroom political deals, my parents were on their hands and knees, scrubbing the very floors those men walked on. They cleaned high-rise office buildings after midnight. They emptied overflowing trash cans full of discarded memos and half-eaten lunches. They sanitized thousands of corporate bathrooms. I grew up doing my homework in empty boardrooms while the strong, stinging scent of industrial bleach and floor wax burned my nostrils. To my in-laws, that smell meant manual labor and lower-class status. To me, it meant sacrifice. It meant my parents bleeding to secure my future. They saved every single penny with a fierce, uncompromising focus. I watched my father undergo 2 major back surgeries and returned to work a week later because he refused to lose a contract. I watched my mother rub ointment into her swollen, arthritic knees every single morning before putting on her uniform. They did not take luxury vacations to Europe. They did not buy designer clothes or lease expensive cars to impress neighbors they did not even like. They funneled every dollar of profit straight into an aggressive savings plan. Their ultimate goal was never to buy luxury for themselves. Their goal was to secure me a piece of the American dream that nobody could ever dispute, manipulate, or steal. When I turned 30, they found this property in Upper Marlborough, a breathtaking $1.8 million modern estate. It features soaring ceilings, custom marble countertops, a professional chef kitchen, and a backyard that looks like a private resort. They did not take out a 30-year mortgage. They did not beg a bank for a loan. They walked into the closing office and bought it outright with a cashier check. Cold, hard cash. 25 years of their sweat tears and aching joints materialized into bricks and glass. But my parents were not just hardworking. They were incredibly smart and deeply protective. They had seen too many successful black families lose their hard-earned assets to predatory lenders, bad marriages, or legal loopholes. They knew that giving a young woman $1 million home in her own name was essentially painting a giant target on her back. So they hired one of the most ruthless estate lawyers in Maryland. Before I even saw the house keys, they sat me down in a leather-chaired conference room and handed me a thick, heavy binder. The house was not in my name. It was placed into an irrevocable trust. Let me explain exactly what an irrevocable trust means, because it is the entire reason Marcus and his family are currently facing federal prison. In the world of cybersecurity where I make my living, we deal with firewalls, encryption, and zero-trust architectures. An irrevocable trust is the financial equivalent of a military-grade offline server. When property goes into this specific type of trust, the grantor completely relinquishes their ownership rights. It becomes an impenetrable legal fortress. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. Not Marcus, not my future children, just me. And because it is irrevocable, it means the asset is completely shielded from creditors' lawsuits, and most importantly, divorce settlements. Even if Marcus and I divorced, he could not claim a single square inch of the hardwood floors. He could not touch the equity. The house legally does not belong to my marital assets. It belongs to the trust. My parents had effectively built a titanium wall around my inheritance. It was a closed-loop system with zero backdoor entries. Marcus, of course, hated this setup from the very beginning. Though he tried to mask his resentment behind fake supportive smiles, I could see the irritation in his eyes. He would often complain late at night that it felt insulting that my parents did not trust him enough to put his name on the deed. He argued that we were a team and that real marriages did not have financial secrets or legal barriers. I always deflected the conversation. I told him it was just my parents being overly cautious and traditional. I never rubbed the financial reality in his face. I paid the heavy property taxes out of my own income. I handled the expensive maintenance. I let him play the king of the castle. I let him invite his friends over and host lavish barbecues on the patio where he would lean against the outdoor kitchen island and act like he had financed the entire lifestyle himself. I let him pretend to be the wealthy provider because I thought protecting his pride was part of being a good wife. The deep, bitter irony was that while Marcus paraded around in his expensive suits pretending to be a self-made financial guru, the entire foundation of his comfortable life was built by the exact type of blue-collar labor he and his family openly despised. He loved the benefits of the estate, but he hated the hands that provided it. Every time my father David came over wearing his faded work boots, Marcus would tense up. He acted as if the mere presence of an honest working man would somehow taint the polished image he was trying to project to his wealthy neighbors. And his family was infinitely worse. When Thomas walked through my grand front doors, he did not see a home built by the absolute dedication of two loving parents. He saw a prize. He saw an asset he felt inherently entitled to simply because his last name was attached to my husband. To Thomas, a man who had squandered his own political influence and wealth through arrogance, my house was nothing more than a life raft. He looked at my parents' calloused hands and saw weakness. He looked at my quiet, accommodating nature and saw a victim. He thought he could simply march into my life and commandeer my sanctuary because his inflated ego convinced him that blue-collar workers and their quiet daughter could never outsmart him. He was completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a trap. To comprehend the sheer scale of the delusion Marcus operated under, you have to look closely at the financial house of cards he called a career. He branded himself as a digital asset manager and a cryptocurrency visionary. His Instagram bio boasted about financial freedom and breaking generational curses. Every morning, he would wake up at 6, put on a crisp designer shirt, and spend hours staring at brightly colored charts on multiple monitors in our guest room. He hosted webinars and charged desperate people hundreds of dollars to hear him speak about market trends and blockchain investments. To his thousands of followers and his arrogant family, he was a self-made financial guru. The reality was a pathetic illusion that I single-handedly financed. Marcus was not building wealth. He was gambling on margin and bleeding money at an astonishing rate. When he drove his sleek black Tesla Model S Plaid to the country club to play golf with his brother Andre, he basked in the admiring stares. He never mentioned that the exorbitant monthly lease payment was automatically drafted from a checking account that only my paycheck funded. Whenever his trading account faced a margin call due to a sudden market crash, he would pace the hardwood floors of our home, sweating and biting his nails. He would come to my home office, close the door, and put on his best performance. He would drop his voice to a soft, vulnerable whisper. He would tell me that the market was just going through a minor correction and that he needed a temporary bridge loan to protect our future. "We are a team, Nia," he would say, looking deep into my eyes. "I am doing this for us. I am building our empire. I just need 20,000 to cover this dip, and we will double it by next month." I knew it was a lie. I knew the money would vanish into the digital ether, just like the last 10,000 he borrowed. But I would open my banking app and authorize the wire transfer in complete silence. I stayed quiet and paid his debts because I was conditioned to believe that this was my duty as a wife. I was raised in a household where my mother constantly reminded me to uplift my partner to protect his pride in a world that is already harsh enough. I desperately wanted to be the supportive spouse who held the foundation steady while he chased his ambitions. I rationalized the financial drain by telling myself that my tech salary was large enough to absorb his failures. I convinced myself that his big break was just around the corner, and that once he succeeded, he would finally become the man he pretended to be. But my financial support did not make Marcus grateful. It made him deeply resentful. He hated the fact that I knew the truth about his failures. While he was out at high-end steakhouses ordering $400 bottles of wine and slapping down a heavy metal credit card to impress his friends, I was the one receiving the alert on my phone. He loved the rush of being the big shot who always picked up the tab, but he despised returning home to the woman who was actually paying it. To cope with his own glaring inadequacy, he began to treat me less like a wife and more like an inconvenient bank teller. His fragile ego demanded an audience that actually believed his lies, which is exactly why he leaned so heavily into his family. His father Thomas and his brother Andre treated Marcus like a financial oracle. They hung on his every word regarding investments and wealth building. Marcus needed them around to validate his fake persona. He needed them sitting in my dining room drinking my wine and eating the food I bought, so he could sit at the head of the table and play the role of the generous, wealthy patriarch. He convinced himself that because his name was on our marriage certificate, he had somehow manifested this entire lifestyle. He truly believed he was the architect of our elite existence, while I was just a quiet woman typing on a keyboard in the background. This absolute detachment from reality is what made him arrogant enough to bring his family into my sanctuary. He actually believed he had the power to replace me in my own home, because in his mind the wealth was his. He thought my silence over the years was a sign of submission and weakness. He mistook my patience for stupidity. He never once stopped to consider that the woman who designed complex security architectures for a living might eventually apply those same forensic skills to her own marriage. He never imagined that while he was busy playing a billionaire on the internet, I was quietly archiving every single one of his financial missteps, every borrowed dollar, and every fraudulent claim. I was letting him build his house of cards higher and higher, just waiting for the perfect moment to pull out the bottom row. The catalyst for the final collapse arrived on a Tuesday evening under the guise of a minor family emergency. Marcus walked into the kitchen with a rehearsed look of deep concern. A pipe had allegedly burst at his parents' house, flooding the entire first floor and necessitating immediate extensive renovations. He asked if Thomas and Brenda could stay with us for just 2 weeks while the contractors ripped out the damaged drywall. Because his brother Andre and his wife Chloe lived entirely rent-free in Thomas's basement, they were naturally part of this invasive package deal. I smiled my practiced supportive wife smile and told him that of course family comes first. It was a calculated concession. I knew exactly who these people were, and I knew 2 weeks was an absolute fantasy. But I wanted them under my roof. I wanted to see exactly how far their entitlement would stretch when given unlimited access to my territory. 2 weeks seamlessly bled into 4, and 4 weeks dragged into 2 agonizing months. The supposed home renovation was continually delayed by mysterious permit issues and vague supply chain excuses. In reality, they had simply found a luxury resort where the maid service was free, the refrigerator was perpetually stocked, and the tab was always covered. My pristine, carefully curated estate was quickly transformed into a high-end frat house for the arrogant and unemployed. Brenda immediately assumed the role of matriarch. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen that my organic spices and imported teas were pretentious and difficult to find. She treated the guest wing like a permanent boutique hotel, leaving wet towels on the expensive hardwood floors and ordering lavish takeout on Marcus's credit card, which was of course tied directly to my personal checking account. Chloe was equally insufferable. She spent her days lounging by my custom pool, scrolling through social media and leaving a trail of empty, sparkling water bottles across my patio furniture. Andre dominated the living room television, shouting profanities at video games from noon until midnight, completely oblivious to the fact that adult men are supposed to have jobs. I endured the microaggressions in silence. I cleaned up their messes, restocked the groceries, and paid the rapidly inflating utility bills without a single complaint. I played the gracious host because I knew that giving them enough rope was the quickest way to let them hang themselves. But the most egregious violation, the spark that finally ignited the powder keg, came from Thomas. He decided that my $1.8 million home lacked a proper masculine space for him to conduct his imaginary business affairs. His sights landed directly on the one room in the house that was strictly, completely off limits: my home office. To call it an office is an understatement. It is a highly secured, locked-down environment. As a director of cybersecurity handling sensitive corporate data, proprietary algorithms, and classified incident reports, my workspace is subject to strict, federally mandated non-disclosure agreements. The room is outfitted with multiple encrypted workstations, a dedicated hardline network connection, and specialized hardware that costs more than Marcus's entire fake stock portfolio. It is my sanctuary and my vault. One afternoon, I stepped out of a grueling virtual briefing to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. When I walked back upstairs, I noticed the heavy solid core door to my office was ajar. A thick, noxious cloud of cheap cigar smoke hit me before I even crossed the threshold. I walked in to find Thomas sitting in my ergonomic Herman Miller chair. His muddy golf loafers were propped up directly on my immaculate glass desk, inches away from my secure terminals. He was loudly recounting a golf story on his phone, laughing uproariously, while casually flicking gray cigar ash into one of the antique crystal paperweights my mother had given me. I stood in the doorway, my voice dangerously low and completely devoid of emotion. I informed him that he needed to leave the room immediately. I explained clearly and concisely that this space contained highly classified data, that his presence was a direct security violation, and that the heavy cigar smoke was damaging sensitive computing equipment. I told him the office was strictly off limits to everyone, including my husband. Thomas did not apologize. He did not hastily remove his feet from my desk. He simply lowered his phone, looked me up and down with absolute unvarnished contempt, and laughed. It was a thick, arrogant sound that bounced off the walls of my sanctuary. He told me to calm down and stop acting so hysterical over a few spreadsheets. He leaned back in my chair, took a long drag of his cigar, and declared that a man of his stature needed a quiet place to think. He actually waved his hand at me as if swatting away a pesky insect, and suggested that my little computer hobbies could easily be moved to the kitchen island so the real adults could handle important business. Hearing the commotion, Marcus jogged up the stairs and appeared in the doorway. This was his moment. This was the moment a real husband would have looked at the blatant disrespect happening in the home his wife paid for and dragged his father out by the collar. Instead, Marcus looked at the cigar ash on my desk, looked at his father's muddy shoes, and then turned to me. He placed a heavy, calming hand on my shoulder and sighed heavily. He told me to lower my voice and stop disrespecting his father in our home. He said Thomas was under a lot of stress with the fake house renovations and needed a place to unwind. Marcus actually had the absolute audacity to look me in the eye and command me to pack up my laptop and work from the dining room table for the next few weeks to accommodate his father's need for a study. I looked at Marcus, and then I looked at Thomas, who was grinning triumphantly through a haze of toxic smoke. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought they had successfully asserted their dominance over the quiet, mousy woman who paid their bills. They had absolutely no idea what they had just done. In the cybersecurity world, a physical breach of a secure room is grounds for immediate catastrophic retaliation. You do not negotiate with a virus. You do not politely ask a hacker to leave the mainframe. You isolate the threat, you lock down the system, and you obliterate the hostile entity entirely. By commandeering my office and violating my secure workspace, Thomas had not just disrespected me. He had crossed a hard legal and professional boundary. And Marcus, by defending the breach, had proven that he was not just a passive parasite, but an active security threat. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply nodded, picked up my encrypted laptop, and walked out of the room, leaving them to their victory. The firewall was officially triggered. The trap was set, and it was time to execute the ultimate system purge. I sat at the edge of my own custom mahogany dining table with my encrypted laptop open and quietly went to work while the circus continued around me. I did not complain about my exile from my own office. In fact, being in the central hub of the house gave me the perfect vantage point to monitor every single one of their movements. I watched Andre drain bottles of my expensive imported bourbon before noon. I watched Thomas parade around the hallways barking loud orders on his phone to people who no longer respected him. But my focus was entirely on executing my exit strategy. Behind the glow of my screen, I was legally and financially untangling myself from Marcus. I was silently locking down every account, canceling credit cards, and transferring my personal assets into highly secured channels. The entitlement of these people knew absolutely no bounds, but Chloe was determined to push the limits of my patience to an entirely new level. Since she had no job and no responsibilities, she had taken it upon herself to redecorate my living spaces to better suit her refined tastes. I walked into the kitchen one morning to grab a coffee and found the glass display cabinet in the corner completely rearranged. My heart stopped. Missing from the center shelf was a delicate hand-painted ceramic tea set. It was not just any tea set. It was the very first beautiful thing my father had ever been able to afford for my mother. He bought it for her after their first 10 years of running the cleaning business, after 10 years of scrubbing floors and saving every dime. It was their anniversary gift, a symbol of their survival and their unbreakable bond. My mother had passed it down to me on the day I moved into this estate, telling me to always remember where we came from. I found Chloe lounging on a pristine white chaise by the pool, applying a thick layer of expensive tanning oil that I had paid for. I asked her calmly where the tea set was. She did not even bother to sit up or take off her oversized designer sunglasses. She just waved her hand dismissively and sighed with deep annoyance. She told me it was hideous. She claimed it looked like something dragged out of a cheap flea market and that it entirely ruined the modern aesthetic of the million-dollar house. So she had thrown it in the trash. The garbage trucks had already come that morning. It was gone forever. A priceless piece of my parents' history, a testament to their love and sacrifice tossed into a landfill by a vapid woman who had never worked a single honest day in her entire life. I stood there looking at her unbothered, entitled expression. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw breath. But I did not yell. I did not slap the sunglasses off her face. I just looked at her, smiled a thin, empty smile, and logged another catastrophic breach into my mental ledger. But the final spark, the absolute limit of my endurance, happened a few days later. My parents decided to drop by on a Saturday afternoon. They knew the house was full of Marcus's family, so they had purposely stayed away for weeks to give us space and avoid any uncomfortable tension. But my mother had baked her famous peach cobbler, and my father wanted to check on the exterior landscaping because he took immense pride in the property they had bought for their daughter. They did not call ahead. They assumed, rightfully so, that they were always welcome in the home they had literally purchased with their own blood and sweat. I was upstairs in the master suite verifying some final legal documents with my attorney over a secure line. I heard the doorbell ring echoing through the grand foyer. By the time I ended the call, walked out onto the second-floor landing, and looked down at the entrance, Brenda had already answered the door. My parents stood on the front porch. My father was holding a small toolbox in his weathered hands, ready to fix a loose hinge on the patio gate he had noticed during his last visit. My mother was holding the warm foil-wrapped baking dish. They were smiling their warm, gentle, genuine smiles. Brenda did not open the door wide to welcome them. She stood squarely in the center of the doorway, physically blocking the entrance like a royal guard. She looked at them from head to toe with a mixture of absolute pity and unfiltered disgust. I started walking down the stairs, my steps completely silenced by the thick carpet runner just as Brenda delivered the fatal blow. David, Sarah, Brenda, said, her voice dripping with a sickening artificial sweetness that masked her deep classist contempt. I am afraid this is not a good time. We are currently entertaining some very distinguished guests from Thomas's old political circle in the main living room. My mother's smile faltered, but she politely held out the cobbler. She softly explained that they just wanted to drop off the dessert for the family and quickly say hello to me. Brenda actually wrinkled her nose and stepped back as if the baking dish was contaminated. She held up a perfectly manicured hand to block my mother from stepping forward. "No, thank you," Brenda said, her tone turning freezing cold. "We have a private chef catering tonight. And frankly, David, we cannot have people seeing the cleaning staff walking through the front door during a formal gathering. It sets the wrong tone for our guests. You understand, if you absolutely must drop something off, use the service entrance around the back next time. Or better yet, just leave it on the porch." Brenda did not even wait for a response. She slammed the heavy custom oak door directly in my parents' faces. She locked the deadbolt, turned around, and dusted her hands off as if she had just disposed of an unpleasant piece of garbage. She did not see me standing halfway down the staircase. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect hit me like a physical shockwave. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My parents, the two people who had scrubbed toilets until their hands bled, who had paid for the very roof over Brenda's head in pure cash, had just been turned away from their own property. They had been treated like dirty peasants by a parasitic woman who was actively living off her son's wife's money. I stood paralyzed on the stairs, listening to the faint sound of my father's heavy work boots slowly walking away from the front porch. He was leading my mother away. I knew exactly what he was doing. I knew my father would just tell my mother to keep the peace, to ignore the insult, and not cause a scene that might disrupt my marriage. He would swallow that horrific humiliation just to protect me. But there was no marriage left to protect. There was only a target. Brenda hummed a cheerful little tune as she walked past the staircase and headed back into the kitchen, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just signed her entire family's death warrant. I did not run after my parents. I did not open the door and drag Brenda out by her hair. In the world of cybersecurity, you do not react to a breach with loud, chaotic emotion. You react with absolute clinical precision. You isolate the infected files, you lock down the network, and you initiate a system purge that wipes the threat from existence without leaving a single trace behind. My in-laws thought they had completely conquered my home. They thought my silence was proof of my weakness. They thought they were the masters of an empire they did not build. They had no idea that I was already holding the detonator. I did not wait for the anger to subside. I rode the adrenaline straight down the staircase, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, until I reached the sunken living room. They were all gathered there, a pathetic tableau of unearned luxury. Thomas was pouring himself another glass of my vintage scotch. Chloe was busy taking selfies near the fireplace, puckering her lips at her phone screen. Andre was mindlessly scrolling on his tablet, his feet propped up on my velvet ottoman. Marcus sat in the center of the plush sectional, looking over his fake crypto charts on his laptop, playing the role of the busy tycoon for his captive audience. I walked over to the smart home control panel on the wall and killed the ambient music. The sudden silence sucked the air right out of the room. 5 pairs of eyes snapped toward me, annoyed by the interruption. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property," I said. My voice was not a shout. It was flat, even, and absolute. Brenda let out a dramatic, breathy gasp, clutching the collar of her silk blouse. Thomas paused with his glass halfway to his mouth, his thick eyebrows knitting together in confusion. Marcus let out a nervous chuckle, looking around at his family as if I had just told a bizarre, tasteless joke. "Nia, babe, what are you talking about?" Marcus said, standing up and using that condescending, placating tone he reserved for when I was being difficult. "We have guests. My parents are just waiting for the house repairs to—" "Your home renovation is a lie." I cut him off, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. And your parents are squatters. There is no plumbing emergency at your house, Thomas. There are no contractors fixing your first floor. I ran a background check on the company you claimed was doing the repairs. It does not exist. Your credit cards are maxed out, your home is in pre-foreclosure, and you came here to bleed me dry. And Brenda just slammed the door in the faces of the two people who actually own this estate. The color completely drained from Thomas's face. The arrogant smirk vanished from Chloe's lips. For the first time in 2 months, the room was stripped of its delusions. I laid their pathetic reality bare on the expensive rug they were standing on. Marcus's eyes widened in sheer panic. His entire identity, the carefully crafted illusion of the self-made billionaire provider, was disintegrating right in front of his deeply classist family. He needed them to believe he was the master of this domain. He needed them to think he was the one pulling the strings and writing the checks. "Shut your mouth, Nia!" Marcus barked, his voice trembling with a volatile mix of humiliation and rage. He stepped toward me, his chest puffed out, trying to physically intimidate me into silence. "You do not talk to my family that way. You are embarrassing yourself." "I am embarrassing you, Marcus," I corrected, not stepping back an inch. "Because you have spent the last 3 years pretending to be a financial genius while I secretly paid the lease on your Tesla, covered your margin calls, and funded your pathetic lifestyle. I know exactly how much debt you are hiding, but it ends today. All of you are getting out of my house." The word house triggered something dark and violent inside him. It was the ultimate threat to his fragile, inflated ego. His father was watching. His brother was watching. The facade was shattered, and the only tool he had left to regain control of his false narrative was brute force. With a guttural roar, Marcus grabbed the edge of the heavy custom glass and steel console table that sat near the edge of the living room. He heaved it upward with a violent surge of adrenaline. The heavy glass shattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, sending jagged shards flying across the room. Chloe screamed. Brenda jumped back against the wall. Before I could even process the destruction, Marcus closed the distance between us. He raised his hand and brought it across my face with a sickening heavy smack. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side. A sharp, high-pitched ringing exploded in my left ear. The metallic taste of blood instantly bloomed on the inside of my cheek, where my teeth had bitten into the soft tissue. The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of my husband standing over me, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes wild with unhinged fury. "You are my wife!" Marcus screamed, a spray of saliva hitting my cheek. The veins in his neck were bulging against his crisp designer collar. "Your house is my house. My parents have the right to be here." If this were a film, the camera would push in right then. It would glide past the shattered glass gleaming on the floor, past the shocked, paralyzed faces of his family, and push in for a tight close-up entirely on my eyes. I slowly turned my head back to face him. I did not raise a trembling hand to touch my stinging cheek. I did not gasp in shock. I did not cower or shrink away from his towering frame, and most importantly, not a single tear formed in my eyes. In that fraction of a second, the physical blow severed the final tether. Any lingering trace of love, any microscopic shred of loyalty or hope I had left for this man, evaporated into the tense air. The marriage was dead. It was a corpse on the floor lying right next to the shattered glass. The man standing in front of me was no longer my husband, no longer a partner to be protected or reasoned with. He was a hostile threat that had breached my physical perimeter. I looked up into his eyes and I let him see the absolute freezing void looking back at him. My gaze was as cold as a frozen lake. I saw the rage in his eyes falter. I saw the exact moment a cold spike of fear pierced his adrenaline because my reaction was not what he expected. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to break down, to fall to pieces and submit to his violent display of authority. Instead, I simply stared at him with the chilling, detached calculation of an apex predator. I did not utter another word. I did not argue. I did not yell at him to leave. I just turned my back on him and walked away. I stepped carefully and deliberately around the broken glass, leaving him standing there in the silent, suffocating tension of the living room. As I walked up the stairs, the metaphorical camera pulled back, zooming out to capture the entire scene from above. They thought they had won the battle because I walked away in silence. They thought Marcus's violence had secured their claim to my territory. They did not realize that I had stopped arguing because there was no longer any need for words. The warning phase was over. The execution phase had officially begun. I walked straight into my secure home office, locked the heavy, solid core door behind me, and sat down at my encrypted terminal. The dull sting on my cheek was a steady, rhythmic pulse that kept me perfectly, beautifully focused. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I opened the master files. The punishment machine was activated, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives until there was absolutely nothing left. I waited until exactly 3 in the morning. The sprawling house was dead quiet, save for the heavy rhythmic snoring echoing down the hallway from the guest wing. The adrenaline that had surged through my veins during Marcus's violent outburst had cooled into something much more dangerous. It had hardened into absolute crystalline focus. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, utilizing the biometric scanner I had installed months prior. Inside, resting on custom foam padding, was a collection of hardware that went far beyond consumer-grade electronics. It was specialized surveillance equipment utilized in corporate espionage and high-level threat monitoring. Pinhole cameras no larger than the head of a screw. Thermal audio bugs the size of a dime. I moved through my own home like a ghost in the night. They had invaded my physical space, they had disrespected my parents, and they had violated my physical safety. Therefore, they had forfeited any reasonable expectation of privacy under my roof. I worked with methodical precision. I placed a micro camera inside the ornate crown molding of the formal dining room, giving me a sweeping panoramic view of the entire space. I tucked a high-definition audio transmitter behind the intake grate of the central HVAC unit in the main living room. I mounted a thermal motion-activated lens beneath the lip of the kitchen island, exactly where Brenda loved to hold court and sip my imported wine. Finally, I wired the hallway connecting the guest suites. By dawn, my entire estate was a fully monitored grid. Every whispered plot, every arrogant boast, every secretive phone call would be captured, recorded, and funneled directly into my encrypted offline servers. With the physical environment secured, I turned my attention to the digital battlefield. Marcus fancied himself a modern digital asset manager, a tech-savvy visionary who understood the complexities of the blockchain. In reality, his operational security was laughably amateurish. He possessed the digital hygiene of a careless teenager. He reused the same pathetic passwords across multiple platforms, usually a predictable combination of his birth year and his favorite luxury car brand. I did not even need to waste time running a brute force attack. I simply bypassed the rudimentary firewall on our primary home network, accessed the router traffic logs, and intercepted his session tokens. Within 15 minutes, I had full unfettered administrative access to his entire digital existence. I mirrored his laptop's hard drive directly onto an isolated partition on my secure terminal. I pulled down his cloud backups, his personal email archives, his banking applications, and his encrypted messaging histories. I was standing inside his digital brain, pulling back the curtain on the grand illusion he had spent years constructing. What I found was a sprawling, chaotic wasteland of absolute fraud. I sifted through his trading accounts first. The magnificent investment portfolio he constantly bragged about to his thousands of internet followers was a digital graveyard. He was heavily leveraged on terrible trades, drowning in bad margin calls, and holding massive amounts of volatile cryptocurrency that had tanked months ago. He was not just broke. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red. But his personal failures were only the surface layer of the deception. The real treasure trove of information was buried in his private email folders and his direct messages. I ran a targeted keyword extraction algorithm across his inbox, filtering for his father's name, banking institutions, legal notices, and financial terminology. The program processed the massive volume of data in seconds, spitting out a chronological timeline of absolute devastation. The great home renovation, the supposed plumbing disaster that had brought this circus to my doorstep, was the biggest, most desperate lie of all. I opened a PDF attachment from an email dated exactly 3 days before Thomas and Brenda had arrived on my porch with their designer luggage. It was a formal notice of default and intention to foreclose issued by a major national bank. Thomas had not suffered a burst pipe. He had suffered a total catastrophic financial collapse. The official legal documents painted a pathetic and glaring picture of a man who had gambled away his retirement on terrible investments and leveraged his primary residence to the absolute brink just to maintain his superficial country club lifestyle. He had defaulted on 4 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had legally seized the property, locked the doors, and initiated public auction proceedings. My eyes scanned the glowing screen as I pieced together the desperate reality of their situation. I found the panicked text message threads between Marcus and his father leading up to their arrival. The digital footprint was undeniable and sickening. Thomas had texted Marcus in a total panic. "The bank padlocked the doors today. We need a place to crash until I can liquidate the boat and figure this out." Marcus had replied hours later, "Just tell Nia it is a plumbing issue. She is busy with work and she will not ask questions. Just pack your stuff and bring Andre and Chloe too. I will handle her." Then came the message from Thomas that made my blood run cold. "Make sure you establish dominance early, Marcus. It is your house. Do not let her dictate terms. Remind her who is the man of the house." The grand plan they had hatched was never a temporary 2-week stay. It was a permanent parasitic relocation. Thomas had explicitly instructed his son to manipulate me to play on my ingrained sense of duty as a wife, and to slowly condition me into accepting his entire bankrupt family as permanent residents in my guest wing. They were broke, destitute squatters, hiding behind a fragile veil of aristocratic snobbery. And Marcus, the dutiful, enabling son, had orchestrated the entire home invasion to save his father's ego from the public humiliation of homelessness. The sheer audacity of the deception was breathtaking. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. While Brenda was standing in my doorway turning away my hard-working parents and treating them like dirty peasants, she was literally legally homeless. While Thomas was puffing cheap cigars, putting his muddy golf shoes on my glass desk, and demanding respect as a patriarch, he did not have a single solitary dime to his name. While Chloe was throwing my mother's priceless tea set into the garbage because it did not suit her aesthetic, she was sleeping in a bed she had absolutely no right to occupy. They were entirely dependent on the charity of a woman they openly despised and actively tried to subjugate. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, letting the glow of the monitors wash over my face. The throbbing pain in my cheek from Marcus's hand had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, dark, and profound satisfaction. They thought my silence earlier that evening was a sign of submission. They mistook my retreat for surrender. They believed that violence and intimidation had secured their empire. They had absolutely no comprehension of the invisible digital net that was now pulled tight around their throats. Knowledge is power, but in the cybersecurity realm, asymmetric information is the key to total systemic annihilation. I now held the absolute unvarnished truth backed by legally admissible digital forensics. I had their bank statements, their foreclosure notices, and their written conspiracies. I did not stop there. I needed total visibility. Marcus's phone was currently charging on the nightstand in the master bedroom right next to where he was sleeping off his adrenaline and rage. I crept back up the stairs and slipped into the room. He was sprawled across the king-sized mattress, snoring heavily, oblivious to the predator standing inches away from his head. I carefully, smoothly unplugged the device from the charging cable, carried it into my massive walk-in closet, and connected it to a physical extraction tool I used for mobile threat hunting. It took less than 4 minutes to pull a complete physical dump of the device memory. Every deleted text message, every hidden photograph, every location tracking log was cloned directly to my drive. I wiped my fingerprints off the glass screen, placed the phone exactly where I had found it, and slipped back out into the hallway. Returning to my office, I began to compile the data. I was no longer a wife dealing with a difficult husband and annoying in-laws. I was a network administrator dealing with a critical malware infection. I began building a comprehensive digital dossier on every single person in the house, categorizing their lies, their debts, and their vulnerabilities. I was preparing the perfect kill shot. I would not strike blindly, and I would not let emotion cloud my execution. I was going to let them continue to act like royalty in my home, letting them dig their graves deeper and deeper, while I quietly rigged the explosives beneath their feet. I did not sleep that night. I sat bathed in the pale blue light of my monitors, peeling back the rotten layers of my husband's secret life. The foreclosure on Thomas's house was merely the appetizer. It explained why they were squatting in my home, but it did not explain the sheer magnitude of Marcus's panic. Men like Marcus do not lash out with unhinged physical violence just because their father is broke. They lash out when they are backed into a corner with no way out. I wanted to know exactly what kind of trap he was in. I ran a deep packet inspection on the encrypted messaging application I had cloned from his phone. He thought using a disappearing message feature on a secure app made him invisible. He did not realize that the physical memory dump I performed bypassed the application layer, entirely pulling the raw, cached text strings directly from the device's storage. I pieced the fragmented conversations back together, and the truth was absolutely chilling. Marcus had not just lost his own money in the cryptocurrency crash. He had borrowed $300,000 from an illicit offshore lending syndicate to chase his losses. These were not legitimate bankers or institutional lenders. The messages I decoded were filled with explicit graphic threats regarding his physical safety. They included surveillance photos of his leased Tesla parked at the country club, pictures of our front gate, and repayment deadlines that had expired weeks ago. He was a dead man walking desperately, trying to maintain the illusion of the wealthy tycoon while violent loan sharks circled our property. But $300,000 did not account for the massive gaping hole in his primary portfolio. I pivoted back to his trading logs and ran an automated forensic accounting script to track his deposits. The software flagged a massive anomaly. 6 months ago, exactly when the crypto market had experienced a massive artificial surge before a catastrophic dump, a single wire transfer of $800,000 had materialized in Marcus's exchange account. He had immediately leveraged that massive sum on highly volatile, unregulated altcoins. Within 3 weeks, the entire $800,000 had evaporated into the digital ether. I needed to know exactly where that initial injection of capital came from. I traced the routing numbers back through his deleted email trash bin, reconstructing the digital paper trail piece by piece. The originating account did not belong to a bank, an angel investor, or a venture capital firm. The account belonged to Thomas. It was his father's entire lifetime retirement fund. My fingers flew across the keyboard as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into a horrifying, brilliant masterpiece of betrayal. Why would Thomas, a man who hoarded his wealth and viewed himself as an untouchable financial titan, liquidate his entire life savings and hand it over to his son? Thomas was deeply arrogant, but he was not stupid. He would have demanded absolute ironclad collateral before parting with nearly $1 million. I ran a localized search on Marcus's hard drive for my own name, filtering specifically for PDF documents and legal templates. A hidden password-protected folder flagged on my screen. I cracked his rudimentary encryption in less than 60 seconds. Inside the folder was the smoking gun. Before I married Marcus, my attorneys had wisely placed this estate and all my major assets into an irrevocable blind trust. Marcus had absolutely no legal claim to this property, and his name was nowhere on the deed. But the documents on his hard drive told a completely different story. I opened a high-resolution scan of a promissory note and a deed of trust. Marcus had drafted a fraudulent legal contract pledging my $1.8 million estate as total collateral for the $800,000 loan from his father. I zoomed in on the signature line. There was my name perfectly forged, complete with a digital notary stamp. I ran the notary license number through a public state database and cross-referenced it with Marcus's digital contact list. It belonged to a disgraced former real estate broker who Marcus occasionally played poker with. They had colluded to fabricate a legally binding document that handed my home over to Thomas in the event that Marcus defaulted on the loan. Marcus had stolen my personal identification, physically scanned my signature from an old tax return, and paid a dirty notary to legitimize the theft. I sat back in my chair, the air catching in my throat as the sheer absolute depravity of the scheme washed over me. Marcus had not just lied to his father. He had robbed him blind. He had convinced Thomas that this house, my sanctuary, was the safety net for his retirement. That was exactly why Thomas was parading around my home like he owned the place. That was why he felt entitled to smoke cigars in my office and put his muddy shoes on my desk. In his mind, he actually did own it. He believed he held the lien on my property. He thought my house was his house because his son had sold him a fraudulent piece of paper to steal his money and gamble it away on digital coins. The tragic poetic irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Thomas had lost his own home to foreclosure because he had liquidated his safety net and given it to Marcus. Marcus had lost his father's money to the market and owed another $300,000 to violent criminals. And now they were all sitting in my living room drinking my top-shelf liquor, disrespecting my parents and treating me like a subservient maid, completely unaware that their entire existence was built on a foundation of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Marcus had not just destroyed our marriage with a single slap, he had committed multiple federal felonies. He had financially ruined his own parents, and he had tried to use my life's work as the sacrificial lamb to save his own skin. He thought he could abuse me into silence while he secretly dismantled my future. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. I downloaded every single fraudulent document, every threatening text message from the loan sharks, and every piece of financial evidence onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I created triple backups on isolated offshore servers. The trap was no longer just a defensive measure. It was a fully armed weapon of mass destruction. I looked at the time on my monitor. It was 6 a.m. The sun was just beginning to rise over the estate, lighting up the manicured lawns and the custom pool where Chloe would soon be lounging. I closed my laptop, slid the flash drive into my pocket, and walked out of my office. I was ready to burn their entire world to ash. I walked straight to the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee. The house was just beginning to stir. I pulled out my encrypted phone and initiated a secure peer-to-peer call with Jonathan, my lead attorney for the Blind Trust. I explained the situation in rapid clinical detail. I bypassed the pleasantries and sent him the encrypted zip file containing the forged deed, the fake notary stamped the bank transfers, and the loan shark threats. Jonathan was a man who rarely showed emotion, but the sheer magnitude of Marcus's stupidity left him speechless for a full 10 seconds. He immediately looped in a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically their white-collar crime and wire fraud division. Federal warrants take time. The United States Attorney's Office does not move at the speed of anger. They move at the speed of absolute bureaucratic certainty. Jonathan gave me a single strict directive. I had to maintain the illusion. I had to keep Marcus and his family completely comfortable and entirely oblivious. If Marcus caught even a hint of suspicion, he might try to flee the jurisdiction or destroy the physical devices linking him to the syndicate. I needed to play the role of the defeated, battered wife until the federal agents were physically standing on my driveway. I walked to the powder room mirror and examined my face. The left side of my jaw was swollen, blooming into a mottled canvas of purple and blue. I applied a thin layer of foundation. Not enough to hide the bruise completely, but enough to show that I was trying to cover it up out of shame. I needed them to see my shame. I needed them to feed on it. Brenda was the first to emerge from the guest wing. She glided into the kitchen wearing a silk robe that cost more than her husband's current net worth. She took one look at me standing by the espresso machine and let out a theatrical sigh of disapproval. She complained about the roast of the coffee beans, claiming it was too bitter for her delicate palate. I did not snap back. I lowered my eyes, apologized softly, and offered to brew a different blend. Brenda paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied my submissive posture and the faint outline of the bruise on my cheek. A sickening smile of triumph spread across her face. She realized her son had put me in my place. Over the next 48 hours, I delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. I became the ghost in my own home. I stripped away every ounce of my usual authority and let them treat me like the hired help. I wanted them to fly as high as possible so the impact of their fall would shatter them completely. Chloe treated the estate like her personal luxury resort. She lounged by the custom infinity pool, leaving wet towels on the imported patio furniture. She snapped her fingers at me when she wanted a fresh glass of sparkling water. I brought it to her on a silver tray without a single word of protest. She even wandered into my master bathroom and casually borrowed my expensive skincare products. I caught her trying on a diamond tennis bracelet from my jewelry box. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she did not even flinch. She just smiled and asked if she could wear it to dinner. I told her it looked beautiful on her and allowed her to keep it on her wrist. Her arrogance swelled to dangerous levels. She truly believed she had conquered me. Thomas was perhaps the most repulsive of them all. Ignorant to the fact that his son had stolen his entire life savings, he strutted around the property like a feudal lord surveying his domain. He invited 3 of his equally pompous friends over for afternoon cigars on my terrace. I served them aged scotch and listened silently as Thomas bragged about his real estate portfolio and his brilliant son. He gestured to my manicured lawns and told his friends that this house was just one of Marcus's many successful acquisitions. He even had the audacity to snap at me for pouring the scotch too slowly. I bowed my head, apologized for the delay, and retreated to the kitchen. But the most dangerous performance was reserved for my husband. Marcus woke up that first morning expecting a war. He came down the stairs with his shoulders tense, ready to resume the screaming match from the night before. Instead, he found me preparing a full breakfast. When he walked into the kitchen, I visibly flinched. I shrank away from him, pulling my cardigan tighter around my body. I watched the tension melt out of his frame, replaced instantly by a toxic, inflated ego. He walked over to me, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and kissed the top of my head. He told me he was sorry that things got out of hand, but reminded me that a wife needs to respect her husband's family. He said the plumbing issues at his father's house were going to take at least another month to fix, so they would be staying indefinitely. I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him I understood and that I would make sure the guest wing was fully stocked. Marcus beamed. He genuinely believed he was a master manipulator. He thought he had successfully beaten me into submission while pulling off the greatest financial heist of his life. He strutted out of the kitchen, a dead man walking who thought he was a king. I spent the next 2 days catering to their every whim. I cooked their meals, I washed their dishes, and I endured their relentless passive-aggressive insults. Brenda hosted a luncheon for some local socialites she wanted to impress, and ordered me to serve the hors d'oeuvres. I walked around my own living room, offering crab cakes to women who looked right through me, while Brenda bragged about her son's unbelievable wealth. Every time they insulted me, every time they made a demand, I documented it in my mind. I fed their delusions. The psychology of arrogant people is remarkably predictable. When they face no resistance, they expand to fill the available space. They became louder, bolder, and infinitely more careless. They truly believed they had completely broken my spirit. What they did not know was that while I was serving them tea and washing their clothes, my servers were compiling a mountain of federal evidence. Every time Marcus logged onto my network to check his dwindling crypto accounts, the FBI Cyber Division was tracking his keystrokes. Every time Thomas boasted about his non-existent wealth on my patio, my hidden microphones captured the audio for the impending fraud case. I was not a victim. I was the architect of their destruction, and they were dancing happily into the slaughterhouse. I watched Marcus sit on the couch, scrolling through his phone, blissfully unaware that a federal prosecutor was currently drafting a multi-count indictment with his name on it. I watched Thomas swirl his expensive cognac, completely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were empty and he was legally homeless. The waiting was pure, agonizing anticipation, but it was also deeply intoxicating. I reveled in the stark contrast between their perceived reality and their actual impending doom. They were living in a fantasy world built on a foundation of stolen money and forged documents, and I held the detonator. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, my encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. I was in the kitchen slicing fresh fruit for Brenda, who was complaining about the lack of healthy snack options in the house. I set down the knife, wiped my hands on a towel, and pulled the device from my pocket. It was a single text message from Jonathan. The warrants are signed. The marshals are mobilizing. ETA is 20 minutes. I stared at the screen and a cold smile finally broke across my face. The performance was over. The curtain was coming down. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I picked up the silver tray of sliced fruit and walked out into the living room where my husband and his family were gathered. They were laughing loudly at a joke Thomas had just told. They looked so comfortable, so entirely convinced of their own superiority. They had flown too close to the sun. It was time to watch them burn. I set the silver tray of sliced fruit on the center of the massive marble island. The clatter of the metal drew their attention for only a fraction of a second before they returned to their self-congratulatory banter. Brenda had completely commandeered the formal dining room. She had ordered an extravagant catered feast from the most expensive French restaurant in the city, charging the exorbitant bill directly to my platinum card. I had received the fraud alert on my encrypted device earlier that afternoon, and I had explicitly authorized the transaction. I wanted them to feast. I wanted their final meal as free citizens to be as decadent and arrogant as possible. The long mahogany table was set with my fine china and the vintage crystal glasses I had inherited from my grandmother. Thomas sat at the head of the table, the position traditionally reserved for the master of the house, holding court like a king. Marcus sat at the opposite end, mirroring his father's insufferable posture. Chloe and Andre occupied the sides, already picking at the artisan bread and complaining about the temperature.